you guys have watched any of my videos, you probably know by now that I'm a huge Boston fan. Actually, to honor the legend that won us the cup in 2011, Tim Thomas. Probably the biggest reason why we won the cup in 2011. Regardless, we have the final two teams playing in the Stanley Cup final. It starts on Monday, May 27th. The Boston Bruins will play the St. Louis Blues, the first time since St. Louis has played in the Stanley Cup since 1970. And the last time they played in the Stanley Cup final in 1970, we witnessed the famous Bobby Orr dive. Other than that, there really isn't a lot of history between these two teams, but this is going to be something that I think is going to be a long series. I really do. Regardless of what happens, I think this series is going to be long. Now, I don't want to get too much into the regular season stats. They did play each other in January. Boston won at 5-2 when they played in Boston. And then in February when they played in St. Louis won in a shootout 2-1. And Binnington was actually in net at that point already when they started making their push for the playoffs. So Binnington has already had kind of a look at Boston, which is something to consider. If he had no look at Boston, I think it might have changed the game a little bit. But the fact that he has a little bit of history in the sense that he's played a game against them, it'll mean not as much as if he hasn't played a team at all. Now, we're going to go through a little bit of the stats regarding playoff stats. Playoff stats for the Boston Bruins and playoff stats for the St. Louis Blues. So we're going to start with just some of the minor stats, and then we'll work our way to the more serious stats. There's about just 5 here per side, just the main stats that you want to look at when you're comparing teams going into the final. So we got shots on goal per game. The Boston Bruins have 33.6 shots on goal per game, whereas the St. Louis Blues have 30.9 shots on goal per game. Not a lot separating the two teams. Boston's averaging a little bit more, but to me that's kind of a minor detail. Penalty kill. Boston has an 86.3% penalty kill in the playoffs, whereas St. Louis has a 78.0 penalty kill in the playoffs. Both pretty solid. Boston with definitely a better penalty kill. We'll see what kind of difference that makes here in the series. Power play. 19.4% for the St. Louis Blues. And for the Boston Bruins, we have 34% on the power play. Really, really good power play for Boston throughout the playoffs. What I found as I watched the games, they were able to figure it out later in the games, the power play, and score goals when it really mattered most. That's something that I noticed while watching the games. Goals against per game. So the Boston Bruins have a 1.94 goals against per game, which is outstanding in the playoffs especially. Whereas St. Louis has a 2.53 goals against per game. So Boston definitely shines in that area, which I think is a huge factor, something to consider going into the finals. And goals per game. Boston scores 3.35 goals per game, and St. Louis scores exactly 3 goals per game. These stats going into this could mean a lot, and they could mean nothing. The playoffs have been nothing short of unpredictable this year. I don't know how to even guess in this series. Naturally, the only thing is there's a lot of factors, and I want to take a little bit of a different approach covering the finals than I did with the other series. And this is something I would like to do going forward, and it's going to be a little bit longer of a breakdown, but I think a more accurate and a more unbiased breakdown. So the thing I want to talk about is I want to take each team and I want to say how the St. Louis Blues are going to win the Stanley Cup, and I want to say how the Boston Bruins are going to win the Stanley Cup. And we're going to talk about both of them, and then I'm going to give you my prediction. So for the St. Louis Blues to win the Stanley Cup, I think that they're going to have Binnington play the exact same way he's been playing, but better. I think Boston's firepower is so consistent throughout the game, and it only gets better from the first to the third period. Binnington needs to play the way that he's been playing throughout the playoffs and consistent all the way through the games. You know, he played unbelievable against Winnipeg. That play kind of tapered off in the Dallas series a little bit, and in the Sharks series he was pretty solid, but there was still times where he's giving goals up that you think that maybe he shouldn't have been given up. I'm a Boston fan, but there literally has not been one goal that Tuukka Rask has given up where you thought,
that was just a bad goal. You can't be letting that in.
Not one. Every goal was like, a breakaway where it's a 50-50. You can never blame the goalie in those situations. You really can't. You hope that he saves it, but for the most part, Tuukka Rask has been playing out of this world. So I think that Binnington needs to play to that level to give his team to win. St. Louis is getting a tremendous amount of production from their bottom lines. And I don't even know if we should call them bottom lines at this point because they're producing so many points and so many goals and such quality play. The same as Boston, right? Their bottom lines are very comparable. So I think St. Louis bottom lines are going to be a huge story in this series. But long story short, I do think that in order for St. Louis to win the Stanley Cup in 2019, it's all on Binnington. Can St. Louis figure it out when the pressure is on the most? That's the question. The reason why the St. Louis Blues are going to win the Stanley Cup is because Jordan Binnington stood on his head and played out of this world like he's played from January for the most part. Going to the other side of things now, why the Boston Bruins are going to win the Stanley Cup. I do think that this is Boston's Stanley Cup to lose. Why the Boston Bruins are going to win the Stanley Cup is because Tuukka Rask is going to be playing the way that he's been playing all playoffs long, making very little mistakes. He's been answering all of our questions, and it's really good to see as a Boston fan. Boston's top line needs to perform consistently. You know, they've been able to take games off against other teams, and I don't think that they can afford to take games off against the St. Louis team. They're way too hungry. I do think that Boston is going to have struggles in areas. Getting to that puck, that extra stride. I think that St. Louis is going to have the step because of how hungry they are to get a cup for their city, to get this opportunity that none of the players have had before. I think that's huge. Not only does Boston's top line need to perform, but Boston's fourth line, second and third line, honestly, I don't have a lot of concern for those areas. They've been pretty consistent throughout the playoffs. Top line has performed, and you'll see if you look at their numbers, you'll look at Marchand's numbers, Bergeron's numbers, Pasternak's numbers. They're really good numbers. But a lot of those points and a lot of the times that they've performed have been in a game or a period, and then maybe they haven't played the rest of the periods, or maybe they've taken the following game off. Boston's following lines have been extremely consistent, and that's what's won them a lot of their games. Boston's fourth line, Corrali, Nordstrom, Achari, or Wagner, whoever fills in that area there. That line is a line that starts on the ice, and there's a reason for that. There's so much pressure on these guys to perform, and they really haven't let us down all season long, all playoffs long. Boston needs to have a full effort from 1 to 4 for their forward, and defense needs to be pitching in just like they have been as well. If Boston's going to win the Stanley Cup, the reason why Boston's going to win the Stanley Cup is because Tuukka Rask is playing out of this world as he has been throughout the playoffs, and they're getting a full effort. Every single line needs to be performing to compete with the hungry St. Louis Blues. Predicting this series is honestly a huge challenge. One of the things that I fear the most as well is that everybody's picking Boston. Most people that I talk to is, oh, Boston's got this. Oh, Boston's got this. To me, that's a bit concerning. There's a lot of people that I talk to, whether it be at work or just friends of mine, that really do think that it's going to be a cakewalk for Boston. And I, as a fan, love hearing that. I love hearing, I think they have a good chance of really winning this. There's two major things that I want to touch on. The first thing is Boston needs to be, and they need to compete and play at a level that is going to match how hungry St. Louis is going to be. St. Louis's hunger for those wins, it's going to be so hard to compete with, and Boston needs to figure out a way to compete with that, and I think that's a full effort from top to bottom. And another thing is, most people, like I said, are picking Boston. That concerns me because most people pick Tampa. Most people pick Washington to beat Carolina. Most people pick San Jose to beat St. Louis. This is one of those things where it's like, okay, most people are picking Boston. What's going to happen? I'm going to go, oh man, this is hard. Come on, Boston. Boston Bruins are going to win this series in game 7. I've heard people pick 5. I think that's nuts. I've heard people pick 4. I think that this series is going to go 7. There's not a chance that Boston's going to walk through St. Louis. I don't think there's a chance at all. Boston in 7. Thank you guys for watching today's video. If you enjoyed this video, hit a thumbs up. If you have an opinion of your own, go ahead and post it in the comments below, and we can kind of get a conversation going there. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel as well for more videos to come, and we'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.